Welcome to this webinar about how digitally enabled organizations use approaches like Agile, DevOps, and Lean to do things significantly differently, or even do significantly different things, because technology enables them to do so. I'm Mark Smalley from smalley.it, and I was the lead editor of the ITIL 4 module, High Velocity IT, from which most of the content of this webinar comes. Now, I don't feel qualified to talk on behalf of our sponsor, Good e-Learning, but I can certainly talk about them. I've worked with them for many years now, first writing stuff for them. You'll find my stuff on their blog, I think, and I ended up becoming, I think you call it the design authority for the course ITIL 4 High Velocity IT. So I can certainly vouch for the content of the course. It's not only true to the book, but it's also true to the intent of the course. And Good e-Learning is the only company who've asked my advice on this, so they're in a unique position. Their online training platform is good, easy to use. I've tried it myself, and they're just nice people to work with. So it's a delight to work with them again. And I think it's probably a highlight of my career that I've got a discount code named after me, Smalley20, which gives you a 20% discount on the courses. I think that's quite a privilege. So this is what I'll be sharing with you in about a bit more than 30 minutes, I think 35 minutes probably. I'll set the scene by giving you the context, the rationale behind this concept of high velocity, and then we'll dive into the key parts of the book as far as I'm concerned. Starting with aspirations that practitioners have, and I think things are changing in the market now. Certainly, when people are able to work more remotely, organizations have to pay attention to the desires and values of their staff in order to attract and retain them. So it's good to be conscious of the kind of aspirations that people have. Then I'll go into 5 objectives which I find particularly useful in really pinpointing what we're talking about in conversations with colleagues and with customers. And it helps me find the weakest link, which is really what you should always be working on. We'll briefly look at the kind of approaches that typify these kind of organizations that use technology in a more serious way. And then I'm using the word tools fairly loosely. Ways of thinking, ways of working. I've selected my 3 favorite tools from the book. And we'll end up with 2 things, with talking about next steps that you could take, and finally we'll deal with the questions that you've asked during the presentation. Please use the question box that's available. Ask questions, make comments. It'd be great to get a bit of feedback on it, and we'll get back to you in about 35 minutes, I guess. Right, starting off, setting the scene. So why high velocity IT? Why did this book, why did Axelos, the owners of ITIL, why did they want this book? And I've sort of summed it up for myself as a result of 4 forces. Firstly, the increasing importance, significance of digital technology for us as not only in the economy, but as a society. You know, just look at the pandemic. You just imagine that the pandemic had happened 10 or 15 years ago with much limited technology. It would have been completely different. So it's increasing in importance and significance. At the same time, the systems, and I'm using the word systems fairly loosely, not in a technical sense, but organizational sense. The systems we're dealing with are becoming more complex, more difficult to deal with. So on the one hand, things are more important, technology is more important. On the other hand, more difficult to deal with. At the same time, we've seen technological process within IT, stuff like we're moving stuff to the cloud, we're using infrastructure as code, for instance, we're applying machine learning to IT. Chatbots is a good example of the application of machine learning. And finally, and most significantly, I think, the IT service management discipline, you could define that as broadly or as narrowly as you like, but it's being affected by other disciplines, and I'm thinking in particular of the Agile and DevOps movements. So not only do you have to collaborate differently with these kind of teams, but IT service management organizations are adopting these practices themselves. Now, this led to the book High Velocity IT, which is about different ways of thinking and different ways of working, making that distinction between the concepts and the more instrumental guidance for organizations that are digitally enabled or even digitally driven. So that's really that sort of sets the scene for why this is needed. And I think we can illustrate the changing situation by looking at a couple of operating models. Well, this is really more of a business model, but I'll elaborate it in a minute. Here you see the classic model of an organization, part of an organization, a line of business, delivering products and services to their consumers, their customers. Bicycles, for instance. I live in the Netherlands, where we make lots of bicycles. And in the production process, you need IT to support it. And IT is typically procured from an internal shared service center, augmented by external service providers. This is the classic model for business and IT, and we often talk, for decades we've talked about business IT alignment, the need to align how IT does its stuff with the needs of the business. I think we're all familiar with this paradigm, this way of looking at IT and business. Now, if we look at the digital business, digital services and products, typically provided by lines of digital business in which, and this is the critical point, IT is inside the line of business rather than a separate shared service center, a separate IT department. Of course, the line of digital business also makes use of generic IT services, but the critical stuff, the differentiating stuff, is in the line of business itself. And there I like to talk about business and IT convergence, where it's not as if IT people are delivering services to business people, just working together. And even the distinction between business people and IT people is difficult to make and possibly unproductive, because IT is the business. So that's an illustration of how things are changing. You'll probably be familiar with these kinds of comparisons, old ways of working, new ways of working, the shift from project-based work to product-based work, from waterfall to agile, from fail-safe systems to safe-to-fail systems. This acknowledges that complex systems are inherently hazardous. They will fail. So it's an illusion to think that you can make fail-safe systems. You've got to make them safe to fail, with the emphasis on resilience rather than reliability. In terms of job profiles, we're looking very strongly at T-shaped or comb-shaped profiles rather than specialized profiles. And some people say that ITIL is old-fashioned and DevOps is new. Well, DevOps is certainly new-fashioned, but I'd like to make the case that ITIL is undergone a pretty radical change. Now, unfortunately, these, and I hope you'll agree with me at the end of this presentation, that things have changed quite significantly within ITIL, and I think this High Velocity IT book is one of the most extreme, most progressive books that Axelos, the owners of ITIL, have come up with. So credit to them. Now, these comparisons, unfortunately, are often presented with religious zeal, people believing that stuff on the left is evil and stuff on the right is sacred. It's complete nonsense. You can't make these This isn't context free. It depends. If you look at the product comparison within product-based thinking, you'll have projects. There are perfectly plenty of situations where waterfall is a perfectly legitimate way of working. So you have to take these things, this is a false dichotomy. You've got to watch out for these. These are extremely dangerous. It's even fundamentalism. So watch out for that. Now, ending up setting the scene, the first part of the presentation with a bit about the book. I mentioned it's for digitally driven and enabled organizations. Now, you might say, aren't all organizations digitally enabled? They probably are, but it's the more significantly enabled organization, such that they do things significantly differently or even do significantly different things, as I mentioned in the beginning. This puts higher demands on IT, requires a different way of thinking, a different way of working, and that's what we try and address in the book. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning about aspirations, the desire of practitioners to have meaningful and rewarding work. So that's part of the book as well. I contacted about 50 people in total, getting their input for the book. Mainly, what do you think should be in this book about high velocity IT? I wrote half the book myself and engaged 22 other authors to write specialized parts. This represents 18 countries in total. And I was particularly pleased with the diversity of the background of the authors, because slightly more than a third came from the core IT service management domain, slightly more than a third from Agile and/or DevOps, and slightly less than a third from non-IT domains. And a good example is Jeff Leiker, Professor Jeff Leiker from Michigan University in the States, who wrote the bestseller, The Toyota Way. Now, his field is management in the manufacturing industry, nothing to do with IT. Yet the lessons that he's learned there are applicable for us. And that's one of the examples of people. So it's pretty diverse authorship. I'm very pleased with that. Also pleased with the fact that this has been well received not only by the IT service management community, but also from the DevOps community. So that's very pleased to get that reception. If you're not familiar with ITIL, on the right-hand side, you'll see the certification scheme, which I won't explain, but it comprises several modules. And this is high velocity IT is one of many, 6 modules in total. It's been followed by millions of professionals, practitioners worldwide, supported by a certification scheme and training and additional publications. So that hopefully sets the scene to dive into now the aspirations, the objectives, approaches and tools to give you a feeling of what's in the book. I'll preface it by saying that the book is not intended to be comprehensive, let alone prescriptive guidance, how you do this kind of stuff, but it illustrates the kind of thinking, the kind of acting, the ways of working that you will typically come across in these kind of organizations. Now, starting off with the aspirations, summarize them in five different things that I think, but please share your thoughts on that as well. Are these aspirations things that appeal to you? Starting off with the raw desire to help people to help somebody at the end of the supply chain, the realization that you've helped somebody, helping get customers' jobs done. That's an oblique reference to Professor Clayton Christensen, who did some work on that field. The desire to trust and be trusted in the workplace. something that not everybody has. There are some environments that could use a lot more psychological safety to enable people to feel more confident in sharing their thoughts, their opinions, without fear for their position or their reputation. That's a serious topic, and I'm pleased to say that in our industry, we've been talking about psychological safety and topics like stress prevention as well, more often. So it's, it's on the table. We're talking about it. Third one is accepting the inherent uncertainty and unpredictability of the complex adaptive systems that we work in. Fourth one is the desire to continually raise the bar. And the fifth one, I think increasingly significant, I'll dwell on that later, the desire to do the ethically right thing, because our work has a significant impact on many domains. So they're the aspirations. Now moving on to the objectives. Now I played around with these for many years now, and I found them really helpful in trying to determine what are we talking about and what do we want to achieve. Starting with the first one, valuable investments. Are you doing the right thing? Are you automating the right business processes? Are you producing, developing, delivering the right digital services? Are you doing the ethically right thing, for that matter? Second one is, are you doing it quickly? Using techniques like a minimum viable product, for instance. Third one is the systems and services that you've produced. Are they resilient? Deliberately using the word resilient rather than reliable, because they will fail and you have to be equipped to get the service up and running as quickly as possible with minimum a minimum of business outage, business disruption. Now the fourth one is interesting because if you've done the first one, you've come up with a solution, you've done it quickly and it's resilient. You think, we are done in IT, but that's where the fun starts really, because it's the co-creation of value between service provider and service consumer. Because until the service consumer actually uses the data, the information that they derive from the applications, and use that data to improve their decision making, because really that's what information's about. It's about reducing uncertainty. So they improve their decisions, but until somebody acts on a decision that's been improved by information that they got from that automated system, no value's been realized. So we're very conscious about that dancing it takes two to tango, dancing the tango between service provider, service consumer, and using each other's resources to co-create value. That's a key concept that permeates all of ITIL 4, by the way, co-creation. Finally, all of the above, you should be able to assure conformance to whatever governance, risk, and compliance requirements apply to your organization, your industry, your country, your planet. So that's these are five objectives that I find useful to determine what are we talking about, and B, where's the weakest link, because according to the theory of constraints, you should always be working on your weakest link. That's where you get the most effect from your work. Now, in order to put meat on the bones and to support these objectives, we came up with 25, we call them techniques. Could have been 20, could have been 30. As I said, these are not comprehensive or prescriptive, but they illustrate the kind of things that you'll come across in these kind of organizations. Now, just to pick on one, if you look at resilient operations, chaos engineering, for instance, that's a technique. By disrupting the production system, you'll build in resilience. You'll increase the resilience of your systems. I'll touch on one of these later, service experience, to illustrate it. So, but this is just to give you a flavor of what's in the book. Now, moving on from techniques which are really about the way of working to concepts and models which are about the way of thinking, the kind of, you could even say the belief system that you have, the way you think about the kind of paradigms that you use to think about IT. Stuff like ethics, design thinking. You can read the things here. I'll touch on two of these later on. Two ways of thinking and one way of working. Those will be the tools that I'll talk to shortly. Finally, the approaches that characterize high velocity environments, the application of lean, agile, resilient and continuous principles. You can see DevOps in there as a sort of continuation of agile with a bit of resilience, certainly with lots of continuous and a bit of resilient built into it. You can see the site reliability engineering discipline in there as well. These all help to co-create value. And as I mentioned, I'll be talking about two models and concepts and one of the techniques to give you a flavor of what's in the book. So let's start with ethics first. The essence of the guidance in high velocity IT is that I've tried to, don't know whether I'm doing it justice with just five bullets, but the essence is technology has become increasingly important. The realization that our actions always have unintended consequences, could be positive, could be negative, but things will happen. The painful fact that we are responsible for our actions, including the unintended consequences, that leads us to conclude that organizations should monitor ethical behavior. Now, the guy who wrote the piece about ethics, Dave Snowden, who I'll be referencing shortly in another context, I think it's the greatest sentence in all of the contributions to the book. He said, just as organizations track their cash flow, they should also monitor the flow of virtue through the organization. And I thought that phrase, the flow of virtue, is really a really cool way of putting it. Tracking the flow of virtue. Are we doing the right thing? That leads us to the conclusion that ethics should be in the core of the education of IT professionals, digital professionals. Now, not just as an add-on, and I'm pleased to say that it's a small part admittedly, but it is part of the ITIL qualification, high velocity IT ethics. And I'd add to this, it's not just about education, it's about values as well. You need decent values to start with, but it's becoming an increasingly important topic. If you think, for instance, about the sort of fairly recent still Boeing 737 MAX tragedy, where software was involved. Just imagine you're the software engineer at Boeing. Are you aware of possible unintended consequences of your work? Do you have concerns? Did you feel free to voice your concerns? Did anybody listen to your concerns and act on them? Now, these are ethical questions, and it's serious stuff. Now, in terms of how can you the practical application of ethics, what can you do? The main thing really is to think about the effect of your work on your fellow citizens and the planet, for that matter. Read a basic book, do a bit of homework on ethics. Made a couple of recommendations about books. Recommend you as well to speak with people from other disciplines. We are usually very technically oriented. Why not speak to some humanities oriented people, in particular philosophy and anthropology? They're great domains that will give you different perspectives. You try and formulate some ethical principles, even frameworks. Some industries have their ethics frameworks, but realize that these principles and frameworks will only help you to sort of clarify your thinking, discuss it amongst yourselves. You end up taking the least bad course of action. It's always messy, morality and ethical decisions, but that's I think we should be increasingly aware of the effect of our work, and think about the ethical side. So that's the first tool I'd like to share with you. The second one, it might look a bit intimidating, and it is quite this is quite a significant framework, the Cynefin sense-making framework. I'll try and simplify it. We could spend the whole session, the whole day talking about this, but it's one of the most powerful instruments that I've come across. I came across it in 2013. The thing that most significantly changed my professional thinking, and even my private life as well, because it gives you a different take on the world. The guy I mentioned who wrote the ethics piece, Dave Snowden, he's the main person behind this framework, and his company Cognitive Edge, I should mention for further stuff on this, but you'll find plenty online. I'll try and take you through the framework fairly briefly. It's a way of making sense of where you work, and in particular the predictability of the environment, the degree of linear causality, to be a bit more precise. On the right-hand side of the model, we have an ordered system where things are predictable, and where you can therefore use what I use confirmatory approaches. An illustration of confirmatory approaches is a project plan with defined deliverables and milestones, or a predefined process with steps. And the idea, why I call it confirmatory, is because you execute the plan, because you can predict things happen more or less as you expected. So you confirm, you sort of tick off the boxes. Yes, we did this. Yes, we did that. On the left-hand side of the model, things are unpredictable. It will be futile to make plans if you can't predict the future. Your information horizon is much shorter, so you have to take things step by step. It's a more exploratory approach that you take, and I'll try and illustrate that. I'm using just a single word to illustrate the various domains of the model. You probably think there are 4 domains, but actually there are 5. There's a domain in the middle, which is the confused domain, which is where you don't know where you are. So the key word here that I've chosen is, where are we? So you're trying to think about, what's the linear causality? Can I predict stuff here, or are there too many unknowns or even unknowables? I think that concept of unknowability is key. So let's take a look at the next domain. In the clear domain, things are obvious. It's if then else. You don't have to do much analysis. Trying to make the analogy with the pandemic, testing and vaccination. If you get tested or vaccinated, it's a predefined process. They just execute the process. If you've got a cold, you're probably not allowed in. So there's not much thinking involved. It's more about doing. But it's ordered. Now the same applies to the complicated domain, which I've characterized by the word aha. You find a result, you expect to find a result, but you have to put some effort into it. You have to analyze things to get information, or you get an expert in who already has that information. You follow a number of steps, you get the result. I might be going out a bit on a limb with my metaphor, but I could imagine that developing a vaccine is an analytical, rational process. You get there in the end, you nailed it. Which is quite a difference between things in the complex domain, which I've characterized by, because you don't know what's going to happen and you expect to be surprised. It's like the challenge that countries have, governments have in balancing prosperity, health, and liberty. See people struggling with these. They have absolutely no idea how a lockdown will be accepted by people until they've done it. They don't know what effect it will have on the number of cases. So it's very much a case of experimentation. And this is often the case in organizations. We pretend that we can predict things, we can plan things, but in practice you can't. It's not engineering, it's more organic. And I like the metaphor of a bramble bush, which you can't deconstruct a bramble bush and reconstruct it to exactly the same position. Things change. You can do that with boxes and arrows. You take a step back and recalculate things. Yet the bramble bush has coherence as well, but it's sort of messy coherence. But life is messy, and we think one of the major learnings for me with this framework was realizing that things are messier than you think, and you can't plan them to death. You've got to accept that inherent ambiguity and sort of conflicting hypotheses and stuff like that. So it's so that's the fourth domain. Final domain. What happened here? Although the pandemic was predicted by many people, it came as a complete surprise to most countries. The action there is to be decisive, take control, stabilize the situation. What you're doing is you're stabilizing the situation and winning time to experiment, analyze, and come up with a solution. So this gives you a flavor of the Cynefin framework, which is a very useful instrument to deal with complexity, working in complex environments. In terms of practical application, this is pretty detailed stuff which deserves a lot more attention, but just to give you a flavor of things, first thing you should do is think about the causality. In which box are we at the moment? And things do change. There are dynamics. Organizations there's often a pendulum between complicated and complex, sort of a natural dynamic going back and forth. You get things under control, then they loosen up, and you get things back under control. So be aware of the predictability, the linear causality. And if things are in the clear domain, you can organize them pretty in a confirmatory way. Write a plan, define a process, use waterfall, for instance, perfectly legitimate if you know the requirements, the priorities, if you know how many people you need to do it, if you know which approach to take, waterfall's fine. If you're in the complicated domain, for IT service management, use a technique like case management, where you allocate somebody to analyze the specific case instead of trying to put it in a predefined box. And for development, you can use techniques like time boxing, because you know the requirements, you know the priorities, you don't know exactly how much time it's going to take and which approach to take, but by using a time box, you get the most important things done within the budget available. Now there's an interesting area, that green area between complicated and complex, that we call that the linear domain, the transitionary domain, where you're going from one to the other. And that's the ideal spot where Scrum techniques can be applied, where you have plausible hypotheses, sort of unresolved priorities. That's an ideal place to do linear iterations, which will sort of resolve those unknowns. If you're in the complex domain, you apply what we call pre-Scrum techniques. And the key point there is to experiment, do multiple experiments, but do them in parallel, and don't let the different teams talk to each other, so they don't influence each other. Then you'll come up with the best kind of solutions. And finally, if you find yourself in a chaotic situation, take control, stabilize the situation, and try and get it up into complex so that you can experiment and find out what to do. So that's as I said, this is pretty heavy stuff, but it's one of the first recommendations I make to people is to look at this framework. It will seriously challenge your way of thinking, and it's certainly added to mine. Now, the final tool I'd like to share with you is service experience, referencing one of the other modules in ITIL 4, the Drive Stakeholder Value book, and a couple of white papers, one of which I wrote myself, and I'm sort of quite pleased with how we developed that theme of customer experience and user experience. Traditionally, when we talk about service quality, certainly people who are familiar with ITIL will recognize the topics of utility and warranty. Utility is fitness for purpose, warranty is fitness for use. And these are familiar. This is familiar stuff. You apply them to KPIs, key performance indicators, and service level agreements. You apply them to service. Now, service I like to see in two dimensions. One is the digital service, use of technology, when you're using a website. The other dimension is when you're interacting with human beings. And to both categories, both dimensions of service, you can apply utility and warranty. This, for most service management people, this is familiar stuff. What we're seeing now is that people are extending, not replacing, but extending the SLA output-based way of measuring quality into more outcome-based criteria and metrics like business impact, business productivity. I'm not talking about IT productivity here, business productivity, and the experience that customers and users have, which you can measure in terms of customer satisfaction, CSAT scores, customer effort score. You often get that, when you get a survey, how much effort did you have to put into this transaction to get it done from a consumer point of view? Net promoter score, would you recommend this supplier? This is something we're seeing developed quite a lot at the moment. Lots of organizations talking about this and applying it as well. You can apply this to what we like to call the in-time service, the individual transactions, but you can also apply them over time to the relationship that you develop with between service consumer and service provider. And the overtime, so this in-time and overtime distinction, and the key point with relationships is trust. Do you trust the supplier's technical ability to get the job done? Do you align with the kind of values that they have? And are they true to their values? Do they demonstrate integrity? And I think often a good sign is where somebody demonstrates reciprocal trust, whether they are transparent, whether they give you access to information that you're not necessarily entitled to, but they're sort of letting you look in the kitchen how you do stuff. Generates trust. You can apply stuff like CSAT and NPS to the relationship dimension as well. So these are things that people are talking about, people are developing, and I thoroughly recommend that you take a closer look at this, depending on how critical the customer journey is for you. So think about extending this, extending your metrics. Think about how to improve customer satisfaction, the customer experience. And typically you'll be thinking about how to apply empathy. Now, I find it interesting to distinguish two different sorts of empathy. Cognitive empathy, which is pretty easy for technical people because it's analytical and rational. That's just understanding where the customer is in the customer journey. Where are they now? What kind of information do they need? What kind of steps do they need to make? What kind of steps do you need to make? And trying to anticipate those steps. That's the easy part. The second part is affective or emotional empathy. The words are interchangeable, which is more about identifying with people's feelings. At least the inferred feelings, because you don't know how people feel, you only infer that from their behavior. So you have to have a bit of feeling for how people feel. Apologizing when it's appropriate, expressing your understanding when things have gone badly. That's an important component to develop empathy. I point you to not only to the ITIL 4 publications that I mentioned previously, but also to a fairly new publication. NEN is the Dutch national standard organization, like the ISO for international standards. And they've recently came up with what they call an NTA 8038, which is a set of, I think, slightly more than 80 they call them minimum requirements to fulfill a better service experience. It's free to download. It's in Dutch and in English. Probably you find it easily enough, and otherwise get in touch with me on LinkedIn, for instance. Feel free to contact me, and I'll send you the link. So that takes us to steps you could possibly take. First thing I'd recommend is thinking about the significance of technology in your organization. Does it place significantly high demands on people who do IT and do digital, such that they require different ways of thinking, different ways of working? Use the objectives to pinpoint where your weakest link is, focus on that. Don't try and do everything at once. Think about practitioners' aspirations and values, and think certainly from an organizational point of view, how explicit you should be about the values that you as an organization have. A very interesting question, whether you can be agnostic and apolitical in this in this era, or whether you have to take a position, because both consumers and employees, I think, are going to look more critically at organizations. What are they doing as far as ecological concerns are concerned, and stuff like that. It's a fascinating topic. Look at the content of High Velocity IT, get inspired. Don't do what's in the book. Please don't do that. Just get inspired by these illustrations of what you could do. Great quote by Taiichi Ono, the father of the Toyota production system, which was the precursor of the lean movement. He said, you have to think for yourself and face your own difficulties. Stop trying to borrow wisdom. We have the tendency to look for best practices and say, let's do that. But it depends on the context. You have to adopt it and adapt it to your own situation. Dangerous to blindly adopt the what without understanding the why. And a bit of advice from my industry colleague Stuart Rance is to start improving with a touch point in the customer journey. So where the customer and supplier interact with each other, that's a great place to start, because the customer usually notices the effect pretty directly. Ending off this with a reference to a recent article by my highly valued colleague, industry colleague Rob England. And in the second half of this article, he gives you some fairly practical guidance how to continue or start or continue this journey. So I'm leaving you with the assertion that if you're struggling with digital, however you define it, and if you're willing and able to reconstruct your way of thinking and your way of working, then not only High Velocity IT, but also the last publication in the ITIL 4 series, the Digital and IT Strategy book, often abbreviated as DITS. DITS and HVIT will help you discover what you need. Hopefully a good place to start your thinking, but a terrible place to stop your thinking. So this is what we talked about. We'll take a look at that, reflect on that during a Q&A in a few minutes. So this is just to refresh your memory. If you have questions, please enter them in the question box so we can deal with them. If you're interested in more information about High Velocity IT, the publisher's TSO of the official ITIL book has given me another discount code to share with you, AB20, which you can use at the checkout. Now, I not only wrote the book High Velocity IT, I also wrote a book about the book, Reflections on High Velocity IT, which I self-published on Amazon for about $10, which is sort of contains a bit more about what I'm sharing with you now, my thoughts on the topic, some thoughts that occurred, stuff that was left on the cutting room floor, you could say, stuff that occurred to me afterwards, additional guidance there. And much of that guidance is available free of charge on the writing section of my website, smalley.it. So take a look at that if you want more information. Now, of course, you can back this up with with courses, and good e-learning have a broad portfolio of courses. Again, don't forget that small E20 discount code to use that when you book them. So looking at the portfolio of courses, it's not just the ITIL 4 high velocity IT module you should look at. In the service management domain, look at the drive stakeholder value and digital and IT strategy, depending on the kind of position that you're in, what you're trying to improve. High velocity IT depends on the loosely coupled information system architecture. TOGAF is great for that, give you a grounding in that. If you're dealing with projects, probably within a product-based context, Agile PM, Prince2, all of the stuff in the DevOps and SRE section is good. We've pinpointed DevOps Leader and Foundation and SRE Foundation, but DevSecOps, for instance, is extremely relevant. Security is becoming increasingly important, and embedding that in the daily work of DevOps instead of seeing it as a separate entity. A couple of things more business oriented that you could take a look at. I would have positioned IT for IT not in the business section but somewhere else. Is the application of IT to improve how IT does its work. I was involved in the IT for IT development of the standard, and I thoroughly recommend you take a look at that as well as ITIL. Some great stuff there. And finally, governance. You know, COBIT is the go-to course for governance. So that's a good addition as well. So you can see this is the application of multiple disciplines to achieve high velocity digital and IT services, and good e-learning can help you with that.